Hi, Jeff Salzman here at Boulder Integral. I'm here with Steve McIntosh, author of Integral Consciousness. And today we're going to talk about some of the basic foundational principles of integral theory. And so I'll start with a very foundational question, Steve, and that is, what do we mean by integral?
Well, of course, there's the dictionary definition of integral, which is integrated or harmonized. It could also mean essential to a system. But the way we use integral in our community is as kind of a defined term to stand for a worldview, a way of looking at the world which is distinct from previous worldviews that have arisen in history. So we'll be obviously talking about how the components of this defined term, integral worldview and integral philosophy, relate to this way of seeing. But the term integral has been around for probably about 80 years, and it has gradually come to be the word that stands for this new way of seeing evolution and consciousness, which is so exciting and which has really become a focus of your life and mine.
Now, when you say it's a worldview that is a new worldview that comes out of previous worldviews, right?
The way to describe it is that it transcends the previously historically significant, identifiable human worldviews, but it also includes, part of the way that it goes beyond is it finds a way to harmonize and indeed integrate the values and the perspectives and the way that previous people in times of history have understood the world and have valued the world. And what we are coming to see is that these historical steps or structures that have allowed culture and consciousness to evolve are still very much alive and with us today. And so what the integral worldview does is it is among many things that it is, it's a way of looking at the evolution of consciousness and the succession of human worldviews that can sometimes seem to be in conflict, harmonizing them, integrating them, and bringing them into a holistic picture that is truly transcendent in the new vision that it reveals and the problems that it promises to solve.
Mm-hmm. So what does integral see that the previous structure didn't, for instance? And maybe even tell us a little bit about the previous structure or two that we're coming out of.
Sure. Well, what's obvious to most people is that here in the United States, there are two, and people are beginning to understand that there are actually three major worldviews that are in partial competition for the heart and soul of American culture. One of them is what's described as the traditional worldview. And this is a very old worldview. Its values are decency, honesty, respect for traditions. Its reality frame is often defined by religious authority or traditional religion. And this traditional form of consciousness isn't just Christian. It's not just sort of an evangelical perspective. You can see similar forms of traditional consciousness that exist in all the major world religions. And not everyone who has a traditional worldview is necessarily a fundamentalist, right? What we're beginning to see is these worldviews are not so much types of people as they are types of consciousness within people. And those who live in the developed world can typically make meaning from more than one worldview. But to focus back, we have the traditional worldview that comprises approximately 30% of the population in the United States, meaning that about 30% have the traditional worldview as their center of gravity. Right?
And this would be the cultural right, Republican, conservative politics.
Right. When we talk about these worldview stages, it's very important that we not give the impression that we're coming up with stereotypes or little pigeonholes that we're trying to put everyone in. But I think there are thousands of examples within our culture in which we can see a degree of interaction or tension between a traditional worldview that focuses on the Bible, for instance, and the values that go with that, and an alternative worldview, which we use the term modernism to describe a modernistic worldview, which doesn't necessarily reject everything from the traditional worldview, but which instead of taking its authority about truth from the Bible, it takes its authority of truth more from science and more from a worldview that, rather than honoring traditions and one's sort of the way of life that is handed down to them from generation after generation, the modern worldview is interested in upward mobility, social improvement, progress on many fronts, both economically, scientifically, in human knowledge in general. And this modernist perspective represents approximately 50% of the population of the United States in terms of its center of gravity, right? Mm-hmm. The mainstream media and much of academia. But from this integral perspective, as we look at these worldview stages that are not only types of consciousness within people, they also represent phases of history, right? So, for example, this modernist worldview that we're describing clearly emerged at a time in history known as the Enlightenment during the 1700s, when science began to show that the worldview supplied by traditional religious authority was flawed, and the scientific frame of reality in many areas came to replace the religious frame of reality, right?
And the traditionalists did not take well to that at first.
Well, certainly were conflicts involved, right. And those conflicts continue.
And some people burned at the stake, as I remember.
Oh, indeed. Yeah.
Yes.
These stages of evolution have not been without their conflicts and without their struggles, and indeed that's part of the system which we can explore.
Right.
But what we're beginning to recognize now is that since really the 1970s, there has emerged a new worldview that can't be readily classified as either part of modernism or a return to traditionalism. And again, we use a defined term here called postmodernism. This has also been called pluralistic or sensitive. But postmodern is the term that's gaining currency within integral discourse because it well defines the antithetical relationship that this worldview has with modernism. So postmodernism is concerned not about progress, it's concerned about sustainability, right? Its tenets include sensitivity to environmental degradation, a great concern for those who've been marginalized or exploited by history. It is a worldview that consists of many different perspectives, and so it only loosely holds together. But one of the things which distinguishes it as a distinct worldview that can be compared to these previous worldviews and sort of having a cell membrane or a systemic identity is that it rejects modernism. It pushes off against the pathologies of modernism, which include industrial military technologies, environmental degradation, the past crimes of colonialism. All these things are problems with modernism that postmodernism arose partially to correct and to remedy.
Now, I noticed that you said it came into fore in the 70s. Most people, it seems, mark it in the 60s and before to some degree.
Right, and so let me clarify. That's a good question, because this type of what we call consciousness, this way of seeing, this set of values, this orientation, this world picture, first begins to emerge really in identifiable form in the 19th century. Some of the most well-known early postmodernists were the transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman, who embodied many of the elements which later become identifiable as a more sort of politically potent worldview that emerges right after the 60s. And so we can see, for example, the transcendentalists embraced Eastern spirituality. They were very critical of modernism and the Industrial Revolution. They were sort of sensitive, and if you look at the culture of postmodernism as we're describing it, and you examine the writings of the transcendentalists of the 19th century, it's all there. Mm-hmm. However, the transcendentalists were an elite group of intellectuals who had an influence on American culture, but didn't have a huge political impact because their numbers were small. But this type of consciousness, this type of alternative set of values that can neither be identified as modernist or traditionalist, continues to develop and bubble up in intellectual circles and bohemian circles throughout the 20th century. But then we see in the 1960s, with the advent of the culture, the counterculture, that it wasn't simply an embrace of Emersonian ideals, but we can see these countercultural concerns and the rejection of modernism as being part and parcel of an emerging new way of seeing, which really began as a cultural movement in the 60s. The art, the music, which really helped attract people to that way of seeing, emerged in the 60s.
Counterculture in general.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I mentioned the 70s because it's only in the 70s that what was the hippie movement morphed into something that had much broader, it was sort of assimilated into the society, not by everyone. There was plenty of tension, plenty of rejection, but it became a political force. It became a sociological entity that wasn't just a bunch of aging hippies, right? We can see it making inroads into the elite academia, into the entertainment establishment. We see the birth of the environmental movement. These are all significant socio-political developments which are transcend the youth movement, which is often associated with the 60s. So that's why I kind of pin it to the 70s, but we can see it as a gradual emergence over 200 years. But it reaches critical mass, if you will, in our society in the 70s. There's again a backlash to a degree with the Reagan years in the 80s, where there was a sort of purging of the excesses that came with the anything goes culture of postmodernism. But then we see in the 90s it really flourishes, that this postmodern, countercultural, progressive, spiritual worldview becomes even more embedded in the mainstream through New Age spirituality, right? And we see that with the rise of popular people like Deepak Chopra, or the rise of yoga or meditation as something which is continuously sort of cascading over into the mainstream, being adopted by the mainstream, even though it's arising from this set of values which we're identifying as postmodern.
Right. So we have these